Welcome to another program in our series, Free Thinking Forum. I'm Bill Weir, the host and producer of the series, and I'm delighted to have with me today Citizens League Executive Director Sean Kershaw.
Nice to be here.
And we're going to be talking a little bit about the Citizens League first, but there's some issues that we can get to. Many people, I think, don't know what Citizens League is all about. Governing for the common good, promoting democracy.
Yeah, the Citizens League has actually been around for over 65 years. We were started in 1952. Our founders included the governor's dad, Bruce Dayton, and we've always been about bringing Minnesotans into policy issues. So we've worked on a variety of issues, probably done over 450 reports in that time. But we are where civic engagement and citizen involvement meets policy impact. That's at least what we try to do in our work.
Great. Well, you're finding the common ground for the common good.
Yeah, exactly. Our tagline is common ground for the common good, exactly.
And among the things you've worked on, the Minnesota Miracle?
Yeah, the Minnesota Miracle is a series of tax laws that changed in the late 60s and early 70s that were seen as innovative and were ahead of their time, really. Charter schools were another idea that we've come up with, that a group of our members proposed the idea for charter schools in 1989, and they became law in 1991. The Met Council is an organization many of your viewers may have heard of. We came up with that idea 50 years ago. So the Met Council is now 50 years old. It's always been in the news, always controversial.
And Citizens League helped create it.
The Citizens, it was our idea that it came out of work that we did in 1966 and 1967. Metro State University is another one in St. Paul that came out of our work in the early 60s. And even little things like the early versions of Minnesota Care and some of what's now Twin Cities Public PBS came out of the work of our members.
TPT, you helped get that underway.
Yeah, that it had been there and that we did work in the 70s that helped in the 60s and 70s to help rethink its role.
Good. And that's just a sampling of the many things you've done. I gather this is a page from your first newsletter.
Yeah, we came out with our first newsletter in 1952, and what was interesting to me is if you were to go back, the graphics look old, but if you were to read the words on there, they talk about bringing citizens into public issues. They talk about the fact that we're sort of in an economic, they talk at that time that we're going to be in a war economy for a long time, and that citizens have an obligation to get involved in the affairs of the community. And that's still, it's as true today as it was then.
That's for sure. I've enjoyed a few times working on Citizens League.
Yeah, that's great.
And now I'm glad to see that you're giving a special focus on older adults and the impact that's going to have as Minnesota gains additional folks in that age range, 65 plus. And this is not a measure of how many, it's how many more in each decade.
Yeah.
And 85,000, is that?
Yeah, well, this chart lists the number of new people over age 65 each decade. So each decade, how many more people are there over age 65 in thousands than the decade before that?
So 85,000, then
Yep.
it dipped?
Well, it goes up and down between 40,000 and 90,000 for the past 60 years.
So in the 2000s, it moved up a little bit from the 47, the decade before.
When we show people the slide and it's in the form that you're holding up, and then we ask people to guess how many, what's the number for the current decade we're in, and everybody every single time guesses low. That if you look at the chart that you're holding up right now, what was in the past was about 91,000 new people, goes up to 285,000 in the current decade that we're in, and then it jumps all the way to 335 in the next decade.
Wow.
And so this is the number of additional people over age 65 from the previous decade. So that's an enormous change that happens in a really short amount of time. And Minnesota is not ready for it. And so what we're doing in our work is educating people on what's going to happen demographically, and then helping them understand what is it that we do about it.
So there's a population explosion of those over 65.
Well, and it's not only the fact that we have a dramatic increase in the number of people over 65, and it's important to point out that, you know, when people are 65, they may still be working, they're volunteering in the community, you know, you're over 65 and you're doing volunteer work. It's that as people approach 85, 90, in average, their care gets much more expensive.
Now, this is numbers, not the change, but the numbers. And we first of all see the college age is pretty level.
This chart shows three important groups. So the public spending is really just about three categories of Minnesotans. There's K-12, so people who are in the K-12 system.
And that's this gray line?
Yeah, and that number is going up slowly over time. There are higher ed students, and that's where the state is investing to make sure that they've got skills for careers, and that number is going up over time. What happens?
Not nearly as fast as the others.
Yeah, what happens is the number of Minnesotans over age 65, for the first time in history, becomes the largest population that we have in Minnesota in about 2020.
And we're almost to the point where there's more over 65 than there are in K through 12.
Yeah, well, there'll be more.
We're crossing over here.
Exactly, and that's something, so when we have more people age 65 and older, more than that we have in the K-12 system, that's something that's never ever happened in history. And so it has implications on who votes, it has enormous implications on the state budget. And so what we're trying to do is say that this thing is going to happen. You know, if we're talking about economic predictions, I can pretty much throw a dart, you know, at a board and it'll be about as accurate as what will happen. With demographics, this will happen. The question is, how do we get ready for it?
And the projected growth in labor force, that is annual average ages 60 and plus, that was up at 32,000, 25,000, but this decade, you're estimating, what is it, 8,000?
Well, it's only about 8,000, and then the next decade, it drops to 4,000.
Wow.
And so it's not just that we have this enormous increase in people who are older and may require care or who are leaving the workforce. The growth in the labor force that we use to pay for that drops down to its lowest level in about 40 or 50 years. So right as we have a potential spike in costs associated with aging, we've got a dip in one of the key factors to help pay for that.
Well, how do we get more people in the workforce in Minnesota?
That's what we're talking about. I mean, there's an important point about workforce participation. There's a really important point about immigration in this, because we literally depend on people immigrating from other countries in order to keep our workforce numbers strong.
And Black, Latino, and Asian populations are growing rapidly.
Yeah, the chart that you're holding up shows the dramatic increase in populations of color in Minnesota. We highlight that, and the rate of increase is about the same as in other places. What's important for Minnesota is that those communities right now are not necessarily doing well in terms of health statistics and education statistics. So not only are we going to have a growth in older people, growth in the number of older people, we'll have a dip in the number of new people, that are coming into the workforce to help pay for them, and that most of the new people who are entering will be people of color. And we've really got to rethink how we approach higher ed and K-12, almost every system, to make sure that they're as successful as they can be.
Now,
I'm just nothing but good news here, aren't I?
You're showing us an important issue that we need to deal with, not just brush it off.
And part of the reason, go ahead, sorry.
And how are you getting organized?
Yeah, so what do we do about it? In the past, the big successes that we talked about, the Met Council and charter schools and things like that, the Minnesota Miracle, were where we developed a report and brought it to the legislature. I mean, that was pretty much the path. On aging, there's not necessarily a single legislative answer. The legislature only gets involved in issues around aging when more or less it's too late to do a lot of other things. So have people saved or not saved? Are they in the right home or not in the right home? Are they taking care of themselves? Are they well? Are they able, to be mobile and to get to the places they need to be? Those aren't always issues that the state can answer. So the very first question we always start off with people of all generations is, what does home and community look like for you as you go through various stages of aging? That one question usually gets people thinking about, where do I want to live? Who do I want to be near? And those all matter to policymakers.
Say that question again.
Yeah, so the question we start off with, because aging is big. I mean, it's a huge topic. How do you boil it down to something that people could talk about? And the question that we've asked is, what does home and community look like?
What does home and community look like?
Because it might be
as people age.
As people age, and it could be an active stage of aging, it could be an assisted stage of aging, and it could be people who are at the end of life. But that question varies across generations. It varies across geographies and cultures. And it's really important to think about what's important for them as soon as they can. It's when people haven't thought about it that they don't have savings and the state needs to pick up the cost of their care, or they haven't kept themselves well and their healthcare costs are expensive, or they're just not living in the right home and community for them.
Well, I think some people may have assumed that even though they run out of money as they get past 65, that everything will be all right, just paid by the state.
Well, there's a couple things that matter there. You're exactly right. One of the statistics that's kind of chilling is that only about half of baby boomers have no net savings.
Wow.
So if you think about baby boom, this is the generation that's really going to create this
They're
this
hitting
change.
65 now.
They're hitting 65 now. They started doing that a few years ago. Some of them have saved a lot and they're very wealthy, and they're going to have a lot of options. About half of them have no net savings. And so they're going into a point in their life when they're going to need some type of savings. That's the first statistic. The second is most people assume that Medicare will pick up the cost of their long-term care, and that's not the case. And so in order to get state support, they have to get rid of their assets and go on Medicaid, which many families choose to do because they have no other options. Others pass on their assets and become, essentially their care gets taken over by the state. That just becomes enormously expensive as we have the numbers that you and I were just talking through, going through the system.
Well, at my age, living in an apartment, I do have some help to not go into a nursing home. Not go into assisted living, because it's a lot lower cost for me to pay even in subsidized housing.
And part of what we want to learn is what worked in your situation, because that's exactly whether people are in the house that they were in 20 years earlier, or they move into an apartment, or a townhome, or some type of supported living situation. What we're trying to learn is what are those toolkits, what are those conversation points that help people think about what matters to them so that they can make a decision with their family. Those are the things that we need to happen so that the state isn't burdened by a bunch of people who haven't saved, aren't well, and are in the wrong home.
Yeah, well, I'd be happy to be interviewed on that, what works for me and other people around me.
And what we find is it's stories like yours that are the most motivating for people. I mean, I can come out and talk about why we need to have the conversation, but what we're learning is that it's people telling their own stories that are the most effective to get other people to think about it. So we're a policy organization, but this is actually a really important policy question right now, to get ready for these changes that are coming in the next 10 years or so.
Yeah, and is there anything more you want to say on that?
Well, I could spend 3 hours talking about aging. What we will be looking at, the issues we've identified so far are very much one of transit. How do people get to the doctor's office, to Target, to how do they get the things they need? How do they get the care that they need? There's a whole variety of types of care that people need. So how do they get that? How do they save? And then how do they stay well? Those are at least some of the initial questions that we're going to be looking at in the work, both to learn from the community and to educate the community, and then ultimately to come up with policy recommendations so that we're able to address this.
Well, I think there's an innovation in Medicare providing an annual wellness exam.
Yes, that we're starting to see some of these changes come down from the federal government. which is important. It's probably not going to be enough as we look at it, but we're starting to see the federal governments and the state governments certainly start to pay attention to it.
Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that it's important for an older person to keep their medical records in one clinic, because it really becomes almost impossible to have coordinated care if they're going to many different medical offices.
And you raise a good point, and it's things like that we learn, from talking to the community. Now, medical records are becoming more electronic, so that's making it easier in some cases for that to happen. But these little things are what we are learning is important.
Mm-hmm.
I agree.
So, we still have more to learn.
Yeah, stay tuned. It's a great topic, and we're excited to talk about it.
Now, just in a couple of days, you're looking at another important issue, the judiciary here in Minnesota. How are they selected?
One of the things that we're going to be looking at through a series of conversations are the things that come up in elections that people may not know about but really matter. And one of those things that we found is what happens in judicial elections. So we call it at the back of the ballot. So when you turn over the ballot where you might have voted for governor or senator or your legislative representative, on the back are often a lot of judicial choices. And there's a whole lot in that people simply don't understand, that I don't necessarily understand.
Well, it's confusing to people. They see only one candidate for certain jobs because no one is running against the incumbent.
Yeah, in many cases they're uncontested. In many they are contested, and people, there have been some very controversial, important Supreme Court elections recently in Minnesota. And so the purpose of our event next week, we're going to be bringing in a former Supreme Court Justice, Kathleen Blatz.
Oh, good.
So who's
Chief Justice.
A Chief Justice, yeah. She's just one of the brightest, most interesting, thoughtful people on this topic. She's going to be talking with people who have a variety of perspectives, both about what we should do and how it works right now. And it's going to be moderated by a man named Brian McClung, who's fantastic on public affairs, very knowledgeable. And so it's meant to be a conversation that people can show up to if they know a lot or may not know much at all.
Well, maybe we can have some television recording of that.
We'll see, yeah.
So I've been aware of how money has been flowing into some judicial elections, and it's really disturbing to see people that really don't have the concept of justice being done by the judges and justices.
The judiciary is obviously one of the three major branches of government, and we're concerned about partisanship, we're concerned about money, and concerned if people don't know how the election system there works. So that's the purpose of the event. It's going to be on Tuesday, the 16th
of May.
If people go to the Citizens League website, citizensleague.org, we'll have information up there if they're able to see this before the 16th.
And if they don't see it, it's probably you'll have some record.
We'll try and put some information up about the event as well. But there will be other events coming up in this series as well. So it's going to be a fun series.
Now you're working on some other important things. Which one do you want to talk about next?
Well, we're doing work right now which is timely in that we're working on transit financing and the Metropolitan Council, which is very active in terms of the legislative session. So by the time people are watching this, many of those issues may be resolved or may not be. Those are happening at the legislature.
I fear underfunding of transit.
Well, the transit funding is underfunded. There's perpetual shortfalls at the Met Council for basic transit services. By the way, one of the primary causes for that shortfall is the growth in Metro Mobility. So if your viewers aren't aware, there's a service called Metro Mobility that takes people with disabilities from their home to a doctor's office, a hospital. And it's a mandated service by the federal government. Transit agencies have to provide it, but it's incredibly expensive. And the costs for that are going up in many ways, like the charts that are showing the growth in aging. Those funds are eating into basic bus services. And so what we're saying is we need a predictable and a stable source of funding for transit. And we put some ideas out there. It's very controversial, it's very partisan, but we'll see what happens.
Well, I see people waiting and waiting in hospital lobbies for their Metro Mobility ride home.
It's a service both that they can promise a specific window or hope for a specific window.
Yeah.
It's a very important service, and the demand for it is only going to grow in coming years with all of the people needing services that we talked about earlier. And there's going to be some opportunities to innovate, but if we don't do something, it's going to eat into basic bus
Now,
service.
that's something I'd be interested in working on.
Okay. Well, we are saying that this is a great, it's a concern that we have, and that there may be opportunities to provide the service differently in the distant future.
Good. Well, we need more ideas on how to solve that detracting from the quality of public transit.
Yeah, that's an important issue. So we're excited and we're hopeful to see what happens this legislative session.
Good. Now, we've got about 7 minutes left. So what should we focus on? How about should we talk about the convention in October?
We can talk about the convention in October, but an important issue that I forgot to mention is we're looking at an issue in St. Paul that relates to whether tax-exempt properties should make what we call a payment in lieu of taxes. So if you think back to City Finance 101, much of the budget for cities comes from property taxes. So what pays for police, fire, trimming your trees, working on the streets, comes from property taxes. A large number of properties, especially in a capital city like St. Paul, are tax exempt. They don't pay property taxes.
It's not just government, but many religious institutions.
It's government offices, it's churches, it's universities. There's a number of categories of tax exempt properties.
Oh, even private universities?
Yeah, in St. Paul, the majority of the uses are either government or higher education or K-12 schools. I mean, that's included in government. Hospitals and certain of those care facilities are included. Churches, there are a lot of churches, but they don't necessarily they wouldn't necessarily pay a lot even if they had to.
Yeah.
So they do not pay in, and St. Paul has asked whether or not there should be a voluntary payment or some sort of payment to help cover some of the costs associated with providing them with life and safety services. And we're going in there with an open mind, first to answer whether we think that's a good idea, and if it is, how would you do it?
Aren't there some other states who have asked for that in lieu of tax?
Yeah, in St. Paul, so a statistic to put out there is in St. Paul, about 25% of property tax value is exempt. So
that's huge.
It's about a quarter of the value of St. Paul properties doesn't pay property taxes. In Boston, what I'm told is it's almost 50%. And so Boston has implemented a voluntary program to get some of the large wealthy institutions, to pay a voluntary payment in lieu of taxes or to provide services in lieu of taxes. And what they actually do is publish, they sort of put some shame into it. So they actually publish a list of what the organizations could have paid and then what they actually paid. And that only applies to the large institutions. It doesn't apply to churches or small property owners. It's only properties above a certain value. But they bring in about $40 million a year in Boston.
$40 million. Well, that is sure help
it's real
in
money,
St. Paul.
Yeah. Now, that's on a much bigger budget. But we're going to be looking at that question in St. Paul. And like all of our work, we've got a good mix of stakeholders and people who are interested in the topic. They're going to start meeting in May, and then we hope to come up with some recommendations in August.
Well, good. Now, we have 4 minutes left. Do you want to say anything about the conference?
Our annual meeting?
Annual meeting.
Yeah, that every year the Citizens League has what we call a civic celebration. It's our annual meeting. And what we've done recently at these annual meetings is honor civic heroes in Minnesota's history. So we honored Don Frazier and Al Quie 3 years ago. 2 years ago, we honored Justice Alan Page for his work and his leadership, not just in the Supreme Court, but in his work providing scholarships. And the last year we honored Dr. Glenn Nelson and Wheelock Whitney, who were really, civic giants in Minnesota who passed away in 2016. What we do in these events is bring people together. They're short, the events aren't very long, and what we try and do is honor, a leader from the past and point forward, saying, what does their leadership teach us about the future? So in 2017, on Wednesday, October 18th, we're going to be honoring two civic trailblazers in Minnesota. Susan Kimberly, who is a former deputy mayor in the city of St. Paul, and was
she did a lot.
She's done, she's been on the city council. She was interim director of the Chamber of Commerce, and was a real pioneer in a whole number of ways. And Dr. Josie Johnson, who Dr. Josie Johnson was very early involved in civil rights work in Minnesota. And these are two very different people who, in their own ways, had a huge impact. And what we hope we do in honoring them for their past work is allow people who are in the room to see what they could do, in their time and place.
Inspire them to do more.
So what we've always done in these events.
Dr. Josie Johnson was a regents of the University of Minnesota.
She's got an amazing resume. They both do. And so it's not just looking backwards, it's really saying, what are the lives of these two people and the work they're currently doing instruct us and inspire us to do going forward. So it's a great group of people from all generations who attend, and the events are a lot of fun, and we think they're meaningful too.
Well, good. I applause for Citizens League.
It's a fun time, and it's a lot of good work.
And I just wish you could keep it up.
Well, thank you very much. It's a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Sean. I think Citizens League will continue to inspire the citizenry to do more rather than sit back and suppose that others are going to take care of it.
I hope so. That's what our hope is.
And this is part of what attracted me to this metropolis in the first place. I had the choice of anywhere in the world to go, and I chose here because it seemed to me that people are willing to work together to solve problems before they get out of hand.
I couldn't have said it any better. It's part of what attracted me to move to the Twin Cities as well.
Yes, and you before the Citizens League, you worked in the St. Paul Mayor's office.
Yeah.
And got acquainted with many policy challenges.
But I'm originally from Nebraska, and so it was exactly what you described that was part of my interest in moving up to the Twin Cities in Minnesota. We have got this great civic legacy, so we just want to figure out how to make it relevant for the future.
Well, I think you're doing it.
Thank you.
So, thank you, Sean, and thank you for tuning in.